Daniel wasn't the type to browse yard sales, but that morning something compelled him to turn down a side street he rarely visited. Perhaps it was the crispness of the autumn air or the way the sun filtered through the amber and gold leaves, casting an almost magical glow over the neighborhood. The yard sale was modest, set up in a small driveway lined with mismatched folding tables. A mix of random trinkets, old books, and faded photographs cluttered the space, giving off the air of a family purging forgotten memories. Among the jumble, Daniel's eyes were drawn to a small wooden box at the corner of the table, its lid slightly ajar. Inside, nestled between faded postcards and a broken pocket watch, was a coin that gleamed faintly in the sunlight. The coin immediately captured his attention. Its edges were intricately engraved with patterns he didn't recognize, and its surface bore an unfamiliar symbol that seemed almost ancient. Daniel wasn't a coin collector by trade, but he had always had a fascination with rare artifacts, their history, and the untold stories they carried. He picked it up, its weight surprisingly substantial for something so small, and felt the faint ridges of its design against his fingertips. As he admired it, the elderly man running the sale ambled over, his face a canvas of deep lines that hinted at years of stories. "Ah, you found my little mystery," the man said, his voice warm but tinged with melancholy. "That coin's been in my family for generations, though no one remembers much about it now. My grandfather used to say it was once part of something important, but, well, those stories fade, don't they?" He gestured to the items around him. "It's time to let these things go. Maybe someone else can make sense of them." Daniel noticed a small, aged envelope attached to the coin with a thin piece of twine. The envelope was yellowed with time, its edges frayed, and the faint scrawl of handwriting on the front was almost unreadable. "What's this?" he asked, holding up the coin and envelope. The old man shrugged. "I couldn't tell you. Never opened it myself. Figured it went with the coin, though. Maybe it's a clue. Maybe it's nothing. You're welcome to it if you want. Call it $10, and it's yours." $10 seemed a small price to pay for such an intriguing mystery. Daniel handed over a crumpled bill from his wallet, placed the coin and envelope carefully in his bag, and thanked the man. As he walked back home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled upon something far greater than a simple yard sale trinket. His mind raced with possibilities. Was the coin an ancient artifact? Could the envelope hold a secret worth discovering? Or was it just a piece of family lore with no real significance? Once home, Daniel set the coin and envelope on his desk, their presence commanding a strange kind of gravity in the room. He sat down and examined the coin under the warm glow of his desk lamp. Its craftsmanship was exquisite, each line and symbol seemingly etched with care and precision. But it was the envelope that truly piqued his curiosity. The paper was fragile to the touch, its faint lavender scent carrying a trace of a bygone era. The handwriting, though faded, hinted at an elegance long lost to modern times. With a mix of excitement and reverence, Daniel carefully opened the envelope, sliding out a folded piece of paper that had yellowed with age. The words written on it, though slightly smudged, were still legible. The letter began with a simple yet poignant phrase, "My dearest Eleanor." Daniel's breath caught as he read further. The letter spoke of a love that defied convention, of promises made in a time of great uncertainty, and of a token, this very coin, that was meant to bind two souls together forever. But it was the ending that sent a chill down his spine. If you are reading this, then fate has placed this coin in your hands for a reason. Daniel sat back, the weight of the moment sinking in. The coin was no longer just a curiosity. It was a link to a story that transcended time. He couldn't explain why, but he felt an unshakable responsibility to uncover the truth behind it. That single yard sale purchase had unexpectedly become the doorway to a journey he couldn't yet comprehend, one that would soon unravel secrets, challenge his perceptions, and ultimately changed the course of his life forever. The following morning, Daniel woke with a peculiar sense of urgency. The letter's haunting words, "Fate has placed this coin in your hands for a reason," lingered in his mind like a song stuck on repeat. He wasn't sure where to begin, but he knew the coin itself might hold the first clue. The intricate design, the strange symbols, and the overwhelming sense of importance it carried, surely someone out there could tell him more about its origins. After a quick search online, he found a local appraiser known for working with rare antiques and collectibles. Within an hour, he was standing in front of a small shop tucked away in a quiet alley, the faint smell of old books and varnish greeting him as he pushed open the creaky wooden door. The shop was cluttered but cozy, filled with glass cases displaying everything from vintage jewelry to ancient manuscripts. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 60s, wearing thick-rimmed glasses and a tweed vest. His name tag read Walter. He glanced up from a magnifying glass and gave Daniel a friendly, albeit curious, smile. "Looking for something special?" Walter asked, his voice carrying the gravelly warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime surrounded by history. Daniel hesitated before pulling the coin from his pocket. "I was hoping you could tell me about this," he said, placing it on the counter. The appraiser's eyes widened slightly as he picked it up, holding it to the light and turning it carefully between his fingers. Well, Walter murmured, his voice tinged with intrigue. "This isn't something you see every day." Walter fetched a loupe from his vest pocket and leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate. He studied the coin in silence, occasionally muttering to himself. "The craftsmanship is exceptional, definitely hand-engraved. And this symbol here," he tapped a spot on the coin's surface, "looks like it might be connected to a specific dynasty or era, though I can't say which just yet." He paused, his brow furrowing. "Where did you find this?" "At a yard sale," Daniel admitted, feeling almost embarrassed by the simplicity of his answer. The seller didn't seem to know much about it, but it came with this letter. He placed the faded envelope on the counter, watching as Walter's curiosity deepened. The appraiser set the coin down carefully and unfolded the letter, scanning its contents with a practiced eye. As he read, his expression shifted from professional detachment to something far more personal, almost reverent. "This letter," Walter said, his voice quieter now, "is a treasure in its own right. It's rare to see something so personal preserved alongside an artifact like this. It suggests that the coin wasn't just valuable. It was deeply meaningful to whoever owned it. But how valuable are we talking?" Daniel pressed, his heart pounding. He hadn't allowed himself to fully consider the possibility that the coin might be worth a significant amount of money, but now the thought was impossible to ignore. Walter glanced at him, as if weighing whether or not to speak. "I'll need to do more research to confirm its exact origins and worth," he began carefully, "but if my hunch is correct, this coin could easily be worth millions." Daniel's breath caught, the words hitting him like a tidal wave. Millions. The idea seemed surreal, almost laughable. He had bought the coin for $10, expecting nothing more than a curious trinket to add to his collection. Now the object in his pocket had the potential to change his life forever. "Millions," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Walter nodded, his expression serious. "It's not just about the gold or the rarity of the craftsmanship. It's the story behind it. Artifacts tied to personal, emotional histories often fetch astronomical prices at auctions. And this letter," he held it up gently, "only amplifies that value. But before you start imagining dollar signs, you should understand something important. If this coin is what I think it is, it may come with more than just financial value. Items like this often carry legacies, histories, and sometimes burdens. You'll want to think carefully about what you do next." Daniel left the shop in a daze, the weight of Walter's words pressing on him like an invisible hand. Millions of dollars were life-changing, an opportunity to escape the financial struggles that had plagued him for years. He thought of his parents, still working long hours to keep their small family afloat, and his younger sister, who had dreams of going to college but no clear way to pay for it. And yet, as he walked home, his fingers brushing against the coin in his pocket, he couldn't shake the feeling that Walter was right. This wasn't just about money. The coin and the letter were part of something bigger, something he didn't yet understand. That night, Daniel sat at his desk, rereading the letter by the dim light of his desk lamp. The words felt heavier now, each phrase laced with emotion and mystery. If you are reading this, then fate has placed this coin in your hands for a reason. He found himself wondering about the people behind those words, the lives they had lived, and the choices they had made. Who were they? What had happened to them? And why, after all these years, had the coin and letter found their way to him? The questions swirled in his mind, keeping him awake long after the rest of the world had fallen silent. He knew he couldn't stop now. If the coin truly held the power to change his life, or someone else's, then he had a responsibility to uncover its full story. And so, with a mixture of excitement, fear, and determination, Daniel made a decision. He would follow the trail wherever it led, even if it meant uncovering truths he wasn't ready to face. Daniel spent the next morning at his desk, poring over the letter for details he might have missed. The faint lavender scent, the carefully chosen words, and the emotional weight of the phrases felt like echoes from a world long gone. He read the letter aloud, imagining the person who had written it. The writer's words seemed to speak directly to him. To my dearest Eleanor, this coin is more than a trinket. It is a promise, a bond that even the harshest of wars could not break. If fate has brought it back to your hands, know that it carries my heart, my story, and all that I could never say. Daniel paused at the closing line, written in a hurried scrawl, "Find what was lost, and you will find me." The words haunted him. Who was Eleanor? What had been lost? And why did the coin matter so much to whoever had written this letter? Determined to uncover more, Daniel took to the internet, scouring archives, forums, and historical databases for any clues. He searched for the coin's design, the writer's name, though the signature was smudged, and any reference to Eleanor. The results were overwhelming, with thousands of unrelated entries that led to frustrating dead ends. But just as he was about to give up, one thread caught his eye. A small online forum dedicated to historical artifacts had a post from years ago describing a coin remarkably similar to his. The poster claimed it was part of a set minted during World War II, given to soldiers as a token of courage and unity. The coins were rumored to be rare, with only a handful ever made, each engraved with a unique symbol tied to the owner's identity. Daniel's heart raced as he read further. One such coin was known to have a tragic story tied to it, a tale of love and loss involving two lovers separated by war. Legend has it that the coin was never reunited with its rightful owner. Could this be his coin? And if so, what was its connection to the letter? The forum post didn't provide much more information, but it mentioned a museum exhibit in a small town about 2 hours away, dedicated to wartime relics and untold stories. Daniel didn't hesitate. He packed the coin and the letter into his backpack, grabbed his keys, and set off on the road, his mind buzzing with anticipation. The drive was long but scenic, with rolling hills and vibrant autumn colors lining the highway. As he neared the town, its quaint charm struck him, a place seemingly untouched by time, where cobblestone streets and vintage storefronts told stories of their own. The museum was nestled in the heart of the town, a modest building with a sign that read, "Preserving the past, one story at a time." Daniel stepped inside, the faint smell of aged wood and history filling the air. A kind-looking woman at the front desk greeted him. "Welcome. Are you here for anything in particular?" she asked, her warm smile putting him at ease. Daniel hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I read about a coin connected to a World War II story. I think I might have something related to it." Her eyebrows raised in interest. "You might want to speak to our curator, Mr. Barlow. He's in charge of the wartime collection." She gestured toward a room filled with glass cases and dim lighting. "He's just in there." Daniel found Mr. Barlow, a wiry man with silver hair and an intense focus as he cataloged artifacts. When Daniel introduced himself and showed the coin, the curator's reaction was immediate and startling. "Good heavens," Barlow muttered, taking the coin in his hands with the delicacy of someone handling a priceless artifact. "I never thought I'd see one of these again." "You recognize it?" Daniel asked, his pulse quickening. Barlow nodded. "This is one of the Unity coins, minted for soldiers in World War II. They were meant to be keepsakes, symbols of hope and connection for those facing unimaginable hardship. But they weren't just handed out. Each coin was custom-made for someone with a significant story." "Where did you get this?" Daniel explained the yard sale, the letter, and the appraiser's assessment. Barlow listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "The letter changes everything," the curator said finally. "These coins weren't just valuable, they were deeply personal. Whoever wrote that letter clearly tied their entire identity to this coin. And if you found it, it means their story isn't finished." Barlow led Daniel to a display case featuring another Unity coin, its design slightly different but equally intricate. This one belonged to a man named Samuel Green. He was a soldier who carried it throughout the war, believing it would bring him back to the woman he loved. But their story ended in heartbreak. He returned from the war, only to find she had disappeared without a trace. The coin was all he had left of her. The weight of the words sank into Daniel. Could his coin have a similar story? "Do you think this coin belonged to someone like Samuel?" he asked. Barlow nodded. "It's likely. But without more context, it's hard to say. The letter you found might hold the key to unraveling its history." As Daniel left the museum that evening, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The coin wasn't just a piece of history. It was part of a narrative that spanned decades, carrying with it the hopes, dreams, and heartbreaks of people he had never met but suddenly felt connected to. And yet, he knew this was only the beginning. The coin's story wasn't just about the past. It was about the present, about him, and about the choices he would soon have to make. Determined to uncover the full story behind the coin, Daniel returned home late that night, his mind buzzing with unanswered questions. Who was Eleanor? Who had written the letter? And what was their connection to the coin? The museum curator's insights had only deepened the mystery, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the coin was far more than a valuable artifact. It was a thread binding him to a story that demanded resolution. He decided he needed help, someone with the experience and resources to dig deeper. After some research, he found himself drawn to a small historical society in a nearby town that specialized in unraveling personal histories through heirlooms and documents. The next day, he made the trip, arriving at a charming old building with ivy creeping up its stone facade. A sign above the door read, "Preserving Legacies, One Story at a Time." Inside, the atmosphere was warm and inviting, with shelves lined with books, old photographs, and artifacts. A woman in her 70s sat behind a wooden desk, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, and her sharp eyes scanning a ledger. She looked up as Daniel entered, her gaze immediately assessing him with a mix of curiosity and kindness. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steady but welcoming. "What brings you here today?" Daniel hesitated, suddenly feeling self-conscious about his story. "I found something," he began, pulling the coin and letter from his bag. "I think it might have a significant history, but I don't know where to start." The woman's eyes lit up with interest as he placed the items on the desk. She picked up the coin first, her fingers tracing its intricate design. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, her voice soft with wonder. In this letter, she unfolded it carefully, reading the faded words with a solemn expression. Whoever wrote this poured their heart into it. This isn't just a love letter, it's a piece of someone's soul. I thought the same thing, Daniel said, relieved to find someone who understood the gravity of what he'd found. I went to a museum, and they told me the coin is one of the Unity coins from World War II. They said it's tied to a love story, but I don't know much more than that. The woman nodded slowly. My name is Eleanor, she said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Eleanor Porter. I've spent my life helping people uncover the stories behind objects like this. If you're willing to trust me, I'd love to help you figure out what this coin and letter are trying to tell us. Daniel's heart skipped at the coincidence of her name, but he quickly dismissed it as chance. I'd appreciate that more than you know, he said. This feels like something I'm supposed to understand, like it's connected to me in ways I can't explain. Eleanor smiled warmly. That's how the best stories start. Let's see what we can uncover. Over the next few hours, Eleanor and Daniel worked together to piece together the clues. Eleanor's expertise became immediately evident as she pointed out details in the letter and coin that Daniel had overlooked. The language in this letter is consistent with the 1940s, she said, gesturing to the phrasing. And look here, this watermark on the paper. It's from a manufacturer that supplied stationery to soldiers during the war. Whoever wrote this was likely in the military. She then turned her attention to the coin. This engraving, she said, pointing to a symbol on its surface, isn't just decorative. It's a family crest, one that belonged to a prominent family in Europe during the early 20th century. It's likely the owner of this coin was connected to that family in some way. Daniel leaned forward, his mind racing. So you're saying this coin belonged to someone with ties to both the military and a wealthy European family? Exactly, Eleanor said. And this letter suggests they were deeply in love with someone named Eleanor. That name, my name, isn't as common as it is today. It's possible we're looking for a woman with a similar name who lived during that time period. Just as they were making progress, Eleanor paused, her expression growing thoughtful. There's something else, she said, reaching into a drawer and pulling out a small magnifying glass. She examined the edge of the coin carefully, her brow furrowing. There's an inscription here, just barely visible. It looks like initials, Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. JH, he repeated. That could be the person who wrote the letter. It's very likely, Eleanor agreed. If we can figure out who JH was, we might be able to uncover the full story. As they continued their research, Eleanor shared stories of her own, revealing a deep personal connection to the work she did. I've always believed that objects like this carry the essence of the people who held them, she said. When I was younger, I lost someone I loved very much. Finding the letters he left behind helped me heal in ways I never thought possible. That's why I do this work. Every story deserves to be remembered. Daniel felt a growing sense of admiration for Eleanor. Her passion for preserving history and her gentle, empathetic approach reminded him of his late grandmother, who had always believed in the power of stories to connect people across generations. Thank you for helping me with this, he said sincerely. I don't know where this journey will lead, but I'm glad I'm not doing it alone. Eleanor smiled. You're not alone, Daniel. Stories like this have a way of bringing people together. And I have a feeling this one is just getting started. By the time Daniel left the Historical Society, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The coin and letter were no longer just intriguing artifacts. They were part of a larger story that was slowly coming into focus. With Eleanor's help, he was beginning to see the outlines of a narrative that spanned decades, filled with love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds of family. But as he walked out into the fading light of the evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that the most important revelations were still ahead. Days turned into weeks as Daniel and Eleanor pored over every lead, every fragment of information tied to the coin and letter. The initials JH, the crest engraved on the coin, and the emotional weight of the letter painted a picture that was still frustratingly incomplete. Their breakthrough came one rainy afternoon when Eleanor called Daniel, her voice trembling with urgency. "I think I've found something," she said. "Come to the Historical Society as soon as you can." When Daniel arrived, soaked from the storm, Eleanor was waiting with a folder of documents spread across her desk. "I found a record," she began, her excitement barely contained. A World War II soldier named Jonathan Harrington, initials J, who was stationed in France during the war. He was from a wealthy family, and records show he was engaged to a woman named Eleanor Winfield. But there's more. Eleanor handed him a faded photograph of a young man in uniform standing beside a woman with a radiant smile. The resemblance between the man in the photo and Daniel was uncanny. His breath caught as he stared at the image. This can't be," he murmured. "He looks just like me." "I thought the same thing," Eleanor said gently. "But there's more to the story." Jonathan and Eleanor were deeply in love, but their engagement was broken off under mysterious circumstances. The official records are vague, but there's a note in a family journal that mentions irreconcilable differences and a disgrace. After that, Eleanor disappeared from all public records, and Jonathan never married. Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions: shock, curiosity, and an unexplainable sadness. "Do you think they were separated because of their families?" he asked, his voice tinged with anger. "All because of something they couldn't control?" "It's possible," Eleanor said, "but that's not the end of the story. I found something else, an obituary for Jonathan Harrington. He died in 1983, but he left no heirs, no family to carry on his name. And yet, here you are, holding his coin, his letter." Daniel's mind reeled. Could he be connected to this man and his tragic love story? The resemblance, the coin, the letter, it all felt too coincidental to ignore. "Are you saying Jonathan Harrington might be my ancestor?" "It's more than possible," Eleanor said softly. "It would explain the uncanny resemblance. And if he is your ancestor, then the story of this coin is part of your family's legacy." Daniel sat back, trying to process the implications. The man who had written those heartfelt words, who had poured his soul into the letter and the coin, wasn't just a stranger. He was family. And yet, the tragedy of his story still loomed large. "Why would the coin end up with a random seller at a yard sale?" he asked, his voice heavy with emotion. "If it was so important, why wasn't it passed down through the family?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Eleanor said, her tone thoughtful. "There's a gap in the story, something we're missing. But I think the answer lies in understanding what happened to Eleanor Winfield after she disappeared. If we can find her, we might find the missing pieces." Encouraged by this new direction, Daniel dove into the search with renewed vigor. Using every tool at their disposal, genealogy websites, old newspapers, even social media, they began to piece together Eleanor Winfield's life after her separation from Jonathan Harrington. What they discovered left Daniel speechless. Eleanor Winfield had changed her name after the war, starting a new life in a small Midwestern town. She married, had children, and lived a quiet, unassuming life. But what struck Daniel most was the name of her youngest daughter, Margaret Harrington, Daniel's grandmother. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. "My grandmother," he whispered. She was Eleanor Winfield's daughter. She must have known about Jonathan, about the coin. But why didn't she ever tell us? Eleanor, the historian, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, families bury their stories to protect the next generation," she said gently. "But it doesn't mean those stories don't matter. In fact, they matter even more." Daniel's heart was heavy with questions. Had his grandmother known about the letter, the coin, the love story that had shaped her mother's life? And if so, why had she kept it a secret? He thought of the coin's inscription, the letter's haunting words, "Find what was lost, and you will find me." The message wasn't just about Jonathan and Eleanor's love. It was about the legacy they had left behind, a legacy that now rested in Daniel's hands. That night, Daniel sat at his desk, the coin and letter before him, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on his shoulders. He wasn't just uncovering a story, he was reconnecting with his own family's history, a history filled with love, sacrifice, and unanswered questions. And as he stared at the coin's intricate design, he realized that the next steps in his journey wouldn't just reveal the past, they would shape his future. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions for Daniel. The revelation that the coin and letter were directly tied to his own family history felt like a door opening to a world he hadn't known existed. Yet, it also brought questions that refused to be silenced. If the coin was a priceless artifact of love and loss, tied to the lives of Jonathan Harrington and Eleanor Winfield, why had it been allowed to slip through the cracks of his family's memory? And why had his grandmother, Margaret Harrington, never spoken of the story behind it? Daniel decided to confront his mother, who had inherited most of his grandmother's possessions after her passing. He drove to her home, the coin and letter tucked carefully into his bag. As they sat together in the living room, Daniel explained everything he had uncovered, from the coin's origins to the story of Jonathan and Eleanor. His mother listened intently, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock and finally to a quiet sadness. "I had no idea," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Your grandmother never spoke of Jonathan Harrington or Eleanor Winfield. She was always a private person, but now that you've uncovered all this, it makes sense." She paused, her gaze distant. "I remember finding a small box among her things after she passed, a box I didn't think much of at the time. It had a few old photographs and some letters, but they didn't seem important. I didn't even keep all of them." Daniel's heart sank. "You didn't keep them? What happened to the letters?" "I threw most of them away," his mother said, guilt flashing across her face. "I kept a few, though. Let me see if I can find them." She disappeared into the attic, returning minutes later with a small, dusty box. Inside were a handful of faded photographs and 3 letters, their edges frayed with age. Daniel's hands trembled as he picked them up, recognizing the same elegant handwriting from the letter he had found at the yard sale. As he read through them, the story of Jonathan and Eleanor unfolded more clearly. They had been deeply in love, but their families had disapproved of their relationship due to their differing social standings. The pressure had eventually driven them apart, but not before Jonathan had given Eleanor the coin as a symbol of their bond. The final letter, written by Eleanor years after the war, revealed her heartbreak at their separation and her decision to keep the coin hidden from her family. "I couldn't bear to part with it," she wrote, "but I also couldn't let it become a source of pain for my children. If they found it, they'd ask questions I couldn't answer. So I've left it where it belongs, in the hands of fate. Perhaps one day, it will find the person who needs it most." Daniel's chest tightened as he read her words. The coin wasn't just a keepsake, it was a burden Eleanor had carried, a reminder of a love she had lost and the choices she had been forced to make. And now, decades later, it had found its way to Daniel, a man caught between honoring his family's legacy and the staggering financial opportunity the coin represented. That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. The appraiser's words echoed in his mind. This coin could easily be worth millions. Millions of dollars could transform his life. His family had always struggled financially, and the money could pay off his parents' debts, fund his sister's education, and secure his own future. But selling the coin felt wrong, like betraying the very story that had brought it into his hands. The next morning, Daniel returned to the Historical Society to seek Eleanor's advice. She listened as he poured out his thoughts, her expression thoughtful. "You're standing at a crossroads," she said finally. "On one side, there's the financial gain, the kind of money that can change lives. On the other side, there's the story, the legacy of your ancestors and the love they shared. The choice isn't easy, but it's yours to make. What would you do?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor smiled sadly. "I can't answer that for you, Daniel. But I can tell you this, stories like this are rare. They're gifts, not just for the people who live them, but for the people who uncover them. Whatever you decide, make sure it honors the story, not just the money." Daniel nodded, her words settling in his mind like seeds waiting to grow. He left the Historical Society feeling both clearer and more conflicted than ever. That evening, he sat at his desk, the coin and letter before him, and made a list of the pros and cons of selling the coin. On one side were the practical benefits, financial security, helping his family, and the freedom to pursue his dreams. On the other side were the emotional and ethical considerations, preserving his grandparents' legacy, honoring their love, and the fear that selling the coin would reduce their story to a transaction. Hours passed as he wrestled with the decision, his thoughts looping endlessly. Finally, he took the coin in his hands, its cool surface grounding him. He thought of Jonathan and Eleanor, of their love that had survived war, separation, and decades of silence. He thought of his grandmother, who had chosen to keep their story hidden, and of his own role in bringing it to light. The coin wasn't just a piece of gold. It was a symbol of everything they had endured, everything they had fought for. Daniel knew what he had to do. The coin had found him for a reason, and it was his responsibility to ensure its story was told, not for profit, but for the love and sacrifice it represented. He placed the coin back on his desk, its significance no longer a question, but a certainty. The decision had been made, though he couldn't yet see where it would lead. The decision not to sell the coin brought Daniel a sense of clarity, but it didn't resolve the practical challenges he faced. His family's financial struggles weighed heavily on him, and the coin's value was a constant reminder of the life-changing opportunity he was choosing to forego. Seeking a middle ground, Daniel decided to consult a friend of Eleanor's, a renowned historian who had connections with collectors and museums that might be interested in preserving the coin and its story. If he could find someone willing to purchase the coin while respecting its legacy, perhaps he could honor both the past and the present. Eleanor arranged a meeting with Dr. Benjamin Clark, a sharp-witted, slightly eccentric academic who had spent decades curating artifacts tied to untold human stories. When Daniel met him in Eleanor's office, Dr. Clark's enthusiasm for the coin was immediate. "This is extraordinary," he said, examining it under a magnifying glass. "Not just the craftsmanship, but the history it carries. The story of Jonathan Harrington and Eleanor Winfield. This is the kind of narrative that museums dream of preserving." Dr. Clark proposed a unique solution, an auction, not for profit but for preservation. "We could organize a private auction," he explained, "limited to institutions and collectors who are committed to honoring the coin's story. The proceeds could be used to establish a fund in your grandparents' name, supporting historical preservation or even education, something meaningful." Daniel was hesitant but intrigued. "You think people would bid on the coin because of its story?" Dr. Clark smiled. "Artifacts like this aren't just valuable because of their rarity or material worth. They're valuable because they connect us to something larger than ourselves: love, sacrifice, the human experience. Trust me, there will be interest." After much consideration, Daniel agreed. The auction was scheduled for a month later, giving Dr. Clark time to gather interested parties and Daniel time to prepare emotionally. When the day arrived, the auction was held in a small but elegant venue, the coin displayed in a glass case alongside the letter and a brief account of Jonathan and Eleanor's story. The room was filled with a mix of museum curators, private collectors, and philanthropists, each captivated by the tale of love and loss tied to the coin. Daniel sat at the back of the room, his heart pounding as the bidding began. The auctioneer started with a modest opening bid, and within moments the price began to climb. 5,000, 10,000, 20. The numbers seemed surreal, and Daniel found himself gripping the edge of his chair as the bid soared higher. Dr. Clark leaned over and whispered, "This is just the beginning." As the bids reached 6 figures, Daniel felt a mixture of awe and unease. He had never imagined the coin could command such attention. But just as the bidding began to stall, a figure entered the room that sent a ripple of whispers through the crowd. An elderly woman, impeccably dressed and carrying an air of quiet authority, took a seat near the front. She raised her hand, and the auctioneer acknowledged her bid, $1 million. The room fell silent. Daniel's heart raced as he tried to process what had just happened. Who was this woman? Why would she bid such an astronomical amount? The auctioneer called for any higher bids, but the room remained still. $1 million, the auctioneer repeated. Going once, going twice sold. The gavel fell, and the room erupted into quiet murmurs. The woman stood and approached the auctioneer, whispering something before turning to leave. Dr. Clark intercepted her, his curiosity evident. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, "but may I ask why this coin was so important to you?" The woman hesitated, then glanced at Daniel, her eyes softening. "I believe the young man deserves to know," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years. She gestured for Daniel to join them, and as he approached, she introduced herself. "My name is Vivian Harrington. Jonathan Harrington was my uncle." Daniel's breath caught. "Your uncle? You knew him?" Vivian nodded, her expression wistful. "I was just a child during the war, but I remember him vividly. He was the kindest, most selfless man I ever knew. When he came back from the war, he was different, broken in a way. I never understood why until I found a letter he had written but never sent. A letter to Eleanor." Daniel's chest tightened as he realized what she was saying. "You knew about the coin." "I didn't know where it had gone," Vivian admitted, "but I knew its importance. When I heard about this auction, I knew I couldn't let it go to a stranger. The coin belongs with a family." Tears welled in Daniel's eyes as the weight of her words sank in. "I didn't know he had any family left," he said. "I thought his story ended with him." Vivian placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but comforting. "Jonathan's story didn't end with him. It continued through Eleanor and her descendants. Through you. That's why I bid on the coin. It's not just an artifact. It's a part of who we are." Daniel was overwhelmed, unsure what to say. But before he could speak, Vivian smiled. "I have no intention of keeping the coin for myself," she said. "It belongs to you, to your family. Consider it a gift from one generation to the next, a reminder of where we come from and the sacrifices that shaped us." Daniel felt his heart swell with gratitude. The coin had found its way back to its rightful place, not because of its monetary value, but because of the story it carried. And as he looked around the room at the faces of strangers captivated by his family's history, he realized that the coin's greatest worth was in the connections it had forged, the bridges it had built between past and present, between strangers and kin. The days following the auction were a whirlwind of emotions for Daniel. The revelation that Jonathan Harrington's legacy had survived through Vivian, and now through him, left him feeling both grounded and transformed. The coin, once a mystery hidden in plain sight, had become a bridge between generations, carrying with it a love story that transcended time. And yet, the journey wasn't over. The coin had found its way back to his family, but its message, its meaning, still felt like something he needed to honor in a tangible way. Vivian, true to her word, handed the coin and the accompanying letter back to Daniel the next day. They met in a quiet cafe, its warm ambience the perfect backdrop for their conversation. "This belongs to you," Vivian said as she placed the items in Daniel's hands. "But the responsibility of what happens next, that's yours too." I believe Jonathan and Eleanor would want their story to mean something, to inspire others. Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "The coin is more than just a piece of history. It's a symbol of love, sacrifice, and resilience. I want to make sure their story isn't forgotten." That evening, Daniel returned home and sat down at his desk, staring at the coin and the letter as if they might speak to him directly. He thought of all he had learned: Jonathan's courage, Eleanor's strength, their unbreakable bond despite the forces that had torn them apart. Their story wasn't just a piece of his family's history. It was a lesson about the importance of preserving what truly matters. He realized that honoring their legacy meant doing more than safeguarding the coin. It meant sharing their story with the world. Over the next few weeks, Daniel worked tirelessly to turn the coin's tale into a living legacy. With Vivian's help, he partnered with a local museum to create an exhibit dedicated to Jonathan and Eleanor, their lives, and the love that had endured across generations. The exhibit featured the coin, the letter, and photographs of Jonathan and Eleanor, along with artifacts from the war that framed their story. Visitors could trace their journey, from their passionate beginnings to the heartbreaking separation that had defined their lives, and finally to the rediscovery of their legacy. But Daniel didn't stop there. Using a portion of the funds raised at the auction, he established the Harrington Winfield Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving family histories and helping individuals uncover their own lost stories. The foundation offered grants to historians, genealogists, and museums, ensuring that the untold tales of ordinary people could find their place in the world. The foundation's launch event was held at the museum, and the turnout exceeded all expectations. Families, historians, and even local students filled the space, each drawn by the timeless themes of love, resilience, and the enduring power of connection. Daniel stood at the center of it all, humbled by the impact of a journey that had started with a simple yard sale. As the evening unfolded, Vivian joined Daniel near the exhibit centerpiece, the coin and letter displayed under soft light. "You've done something remarkable," she said, her voice filled with pride. "Jonathan and Eleanor's story is alive again, and it's inspiring so many people." Daniel smiled, his gaze fixed on the coin. "I think they'd be happy to know their love still matters," he said. "And I think it's taught me something too, that what we leave behind isn't about money or possessions. It's about the connections we make and the stories we share." The crowd began to gather around as Daniel stepped up to deliver a short speech. His voice, though nervous at first, grew steady as he spoke. "This coin may be small," he began, holding it up for everyone to see, "but it carries a story that's larger than life. It reminds us that love, even in the face of loss and hardship, can endure. And it challenges us to look at the stories in our own families, the triumphs, the sacrifices, and even the heartbreaks, and find the lessons they hold. That's what this coin has taught me, and I hope it will inspire you to discover and honor your own histories." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace. The coin had brought him full circle, from curiosity to discovery, from confusion to understanding, and finally, from selfish considerations to a selfless act of preservation. Its true value had never been in its material worth, but in the story it carried and the lives it touched. As the event wound down, Daniel found himself alone in the exhibit, standing before the coin that had changed everything. He thought of Jonathan and Eleanor, of the love they had shared and the legacy they had left behind. In that moment, he realized the coin's message wasn't just about the past. It was a call to action for the future, a reminder to cherish the bonds we form and the stories we create. And as he turned to leave, Daniel felt a quiet certainty that the coin had fulfilled its purpose. It had found its way into his hands, not to bring wealth or fame, but to teach him and the world the enduring power of love, family, and the stories that connect us all.